What happens when an entire family vanishes overnight, leaving not a single trace of struggle? No witnesses, just a concise note on the kitchen table. This mystery, like a shadow, hung over a quiet Pennsylvania Amish community in 1992 when the seven-member Lapp family disappeared without a trace from their secluded farm. For 10 long years, the community, known for its deep faith and patience, prayed, speculated, and waited, but answers never came. However, fate, or perhaps Providence, had other plans. It was only after an old photograph was re-examined with new, insightful attention that a chilling truth slowly but relentlessly began to surface, capable of shaking not only this peaceful community but anyone who dared to peer into the abyss of this enigma. The disappearance. It was a deceptively peaceful spring morning in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, as nature was just beginning to awaken from its winter slumber, and the air was filled with the sense of fresh earth and budding growth. The Lapp family farm, nestled among emerald fields and neat fences, stood in its usual quiet serenity, no different from any other Amish homestead where life flowed to a centuries-old rhythm. The sun had already risen above the horizon, bathing the yard in soft golden light, but something in this idyllic scene was amiss. When neighbors, accustomed to the early morning bustle at the Lapp farm, arrived on Monday morning to help with routine farm chores, they were met with an uncharacteristic, unsettling silence. There was no sign of recent activity in the yard. The children weren't chasing chickens as usual, and no familiar column of smoke rose from the house's chimney, announcing the start of a new day. The house door was unlocked, and upon entering, the neighbors found only a single, handwritten note, neatly placed on the kitchen table, as if awaiting its reader. The handwriting was familiar, belonging to the head of the household, Aaron. It read, "Gone for the weekend. Going to visit relatives on church business. We'll be back Monday. Don't worry about the animals. Arrange for the neighbor boys to help. Aaron." That was all. No additional explanations, no goodbyes, no hints of what might have happened. Just a few lines written in a calm, ordinary tone. But Aaron, his faithful wife Miriam, and their 5 children, eldest Eli, followed by Michael, gentle Sarah, mischievous Ruth, and tiny Daisy, never returned. Monday turned into Tuesday, then Wednesday, and their absence became increasingly palpable, transforming from a temporary trip into a frightening, inexplicable disappearance. The silence on the Lapp farm now sounded not serene, but ominous, portending something far darker than just an extended trip. The initial search concerned neighbors, their hearts heavy with a premonition of trouble, immediately notified Aaron's brother, Levi, who lived just a few miles from the vanished family. Levi, a thorough and sensible man, hurried to the farm, hoping to find some explanation for what was happening. However, his expectations were not met. He found the house in perfect order, as if its occupants had only stepped out for a moment. Beds were neatly made, dishes were clean and put away. Nothing indicated a hasty or sudden departure. This was strange. The family's horses and buggies, their primary means of transportation, were gone, but with them, all traces of where they might have gone had also vanished. No wool tracks on the damp ground, no hoof prints leading towards the road. Just emptiness. Levi, understanding the seriousness of the situation, informed the local bishop, who, in turn, contacted the police, a step extremely rare and almost unprecedented in Amish tradition, where internal matters were usually resolved within the community, without the intervention of English authorities. The arriving investigators, despite their initial bewilderment, began their work. They questioned neighbors and family members, trying to gather any scraps of information, searched surrounding farms, and thoroughly combed nearby highways and country roads, but no leads were found. There were no reports of accidents, no unusual sightings, no evidence that anyone had seen the Lapp family after their supposed departure. It seemed they had simply vanished into thin air. After several days, finding nothing that could shed light on the mystery, the investigators quietly withdrew, admitting their helplessness. The Amish community, not wishing to involve external authorities too deeply in their affairs, did not insist on continuing the investigation. For them, it was a test of faith, and they preferred to rely on divine providence rather than human efforts. The case was quietly closed as a voluntary disappearance, and it soon went cold, becoming one of those unsolved mysteries that, over time, gather the dust of oblivion but never completely fade from memory. However, for Levi Lapp and other close relatives, this mystery remained an unhealed wound, a constant reminder. The recollection. Let's fast forward 10 years, to 2002. Time seemed to have slowed for Levi Lapp, whose life had undergone significant changes. By then, he had lost his wife, Rebecca, and spent most of his time alone, managing his furniture workshop, where the scent of fresh wood and shavings was his only constant companion, and tending to his own extensive property. His days were filled with labor and silence. But every year, on the same spring morning when nature reawakened, Levi opened his home to hold a memorial service for the family who never returned. It was his personal ritual, a way to preserve the memory of those he loved and missed so dearly. On the 10th anniversary of the disappearance, something felt different. The atmosphere was more intimate than usual. The gathering was smaller, the faces of those present older, their wrinkles deepened, reflecting the burden of years lived and the unsolved mystery. Levi's mother, Esther, whose eyes were full of enduring sadness, was there, as her cousins Samuel and Rebecca, and several other community elders whose wise but weary gazes spoke volumes. In the center of Levi's living room stood a large wooden table, covered not with traditional food, as was customary at Amish gatherings, but with mementos carefully preserved for a decade. There were hand-sewn bonnets belonging to the girls, homemade wooden toys that once delighted the boys, and numerous family photographs capturing happy moments of the Lapp family's life. In the very center, under glass, lay the original note, written in Aaron's hand. The same words, the same unsolved mystery. 10 years had passed, but no answers had appeared, and each year this note, like a silent witness, served as a reminder of the gaping void left by the vanished family. The clue in the background. Then came the moment that changed everything, a moment when chance, or perhaps fate, decided to pull back the curtain on the mystery. Daniel, a distant relative who had been silently lost in thought until then, picked up one of the photographs on the table. It was a police copy of a family portrait taken just a week before the disappearance, showing Aaron and Miriam with their children, smiling in front of their white farmhouse against the familiar rural landscape. But Daniel wasn't looking at their faces, not at their happy smiles, but something else, something that had remained unnoticed until then. His gaze was fixed on the clothesline stretched behind them, on which freshly washed laundry was drying. Why would Miriam be doing laundry in the morning if they were leaving for the weekend? He asked, his voice full of bewilderment, his brows furrowed. She would never leave clean laundry out to dry for 3 days. Amish women don't do that. It goes against their habits, their order. A complete silence fell over the room. Everyone present, as if on cue, leaned in to examine the photo more closely, searching for what had eluded their attention for 10 years. And then Mary, Miriam's best friend, whose eyes were sharp and observant, pointed to something strange, something that stood out among the ordinary clothes on the line. It was an item that clearly did not belong to the Lapp family. A fluorescent green-yellow vest, bright and unnatural for Amish life, with the word police barely discernible on the back, like a ghost from another world appearing in this idyllic photograph. This discovery seemed to pierce the silence like lightning, and a premonition of something sinister hung in the air. The forgotten guest. Levi's thoughts fluttered like a flock of startled birds, trying to grasp elusive memories. A name surfaced, like a forgotten melody, suddenly playing in his mind with a new, unsettling intonation. "Officer Breener," he said aloud, his voice full of surprise and sudden insight. "Paul Breener. He used to visit us often back then. He helped us build barns, even fixed fences. A good man. He was close with Aaron. They often talked, shared news. No one present could recall seeing him since the family disappeared. His absence seemed as complete as the lapse. Why was his vest in Miriam's laundry? Rebecca asked, her voice full of bewilderment, her eyes wide with sudden realization. No one had an answer. And suddenly, the idea that Aaron and his family had simply left voluntarily, as stated in the note, seemed less likely, almost absurd. This small detail, this bright vest against the backdrop of Amish simplicity, shattered the entire neat picture of a voluntary departure. The group, gripped by a new premonition, agreed that Levi should find this vest, if it was still there, if it hadn't been removed or destroyed. Returning to Aaron's house, Levi took out a set of keys, one for Aaron's house, the other for an old farm on a separate plot that Aaron had acquired shortly before the disappearance. He hadn't been there for months, preferring not to disturb the ghosts of the past. The house looked untouched, as if preserved in time, a ghost of the past holding its secrets. Dust hung in the air like a memory. Every ray of light penetrating through the windows picked out billions of dancing particles. Upstairs in the bedroom where Aaron and Miriam once slept, he found it, a cedar chest that his late wife Rebecca had used to store Aaron and Miriam's belongings, their personal effects, which she had carefully collected after their disappearance. And right on top, neatly and carefully folded, as if awaiting its owner, lay the police vest. Bright, clean, intact, with a name embroidered in white thread, P. Breener. This was irrefutable proof, material confirmation that Officer Breener had been there that morning the Lapp family disappeared. And this discovery seemed to open a new, much more sinister chapter in this long-standing mystery. Part 2. The vest, the visit, and the lie. The vest and the name. Levi held the fluorescent vest in his hands, its material cool and smooth to the touch. Sunlight streaming through the dusty window of Aaron's old bedroom illuminated the words embroidered on the chest, P. Breener. The name struck him like a suddenly remembered, long-forgotten song, now playing in his mind with a new, unsettling intonation. Paul Breener. He was more than just a local officer performing his duties. He was a familiar face at church events, a man always ready to help with barn raisings, and someone Aaron had once called a friend, trusting him with his thoughts and concerns. Why had Levi never noticed his absence until now? Why had Breener never inquired about his missing vest, which seemed so crucial to his work? These questions, like sharp needles, pierced Levi's consciousness, making his heart beat faster. Levi carefully placed the vest on the passenger seat of his old but reliable car. He didn't call. He didn't write. He didn't wait. He drove straight to the New Holland police station, driven by a sudden surge of determination and a premonition that the answers he had sought for so long might be closer than he had ever imagined. Every mile of the journey felt like a step towards the truth, and the tension mounted with each passing minute. The first visit. The station was quiet, too quiet for what Levi had imagined, his mind already picturing scenes of bustling activity. He approached the front desk, where a young officer named Jenkins sat engrossed in some paperwork. Levi, trying to remain calm, inquired about Officer Breener. The young officer, looking up, politely shrugged, his face showing slight bewilderment. "He's out on assignment," Jenkins replied, his voice even and indifferent. "Hasn't checked in since noon. Perhaps he has communication issues in remote areas." "Do you know where he might be?" Levi asked, trying to hide his disappointment. "Hard to say," Jenkins replied, shrugging again. "I can pass on a message when he returns." "No, thank you," Levi said, clutching the vest under his arm as if it were a priceless artifact. "I'll come back later. This is something I need to say in person. It's very important." He felt that a phone call or an intermediary wouldn't yield the desired result. He needed to see Breener face-to-face to understand what lay behind his absence and this strange vest. Levi turned and left the station, his resolve only strengthened. A strange encounter. Levi drove through the countryside, familiar landscapes passing by, but his thoughts were far away. The vest still lay on the seat beside him, like a silent witness. Passing by the neighboring Yoder farm, he noticed something strange that caught his attention. Two men in dark uniforms, not police uniforms, were arguing with Jacob Yoder near the barn. Their uniforms had no patches, no names, no visible identification, which immediately raised suspicion. Levi, obeying a sudden impulse, stopped his car and got out. The exchange was tense, words sharp and aggressive. "We've told you already," one of the strangers said, his voice full of menace. "Your land is valuable. It's time to sell. Don't be stubborn." "This land has belonged to my family for generations," Jacob replied firmly, his face pale but his voice resolute. "We will not sell. This is our home, our life. You Amish think you can sit on valuable land forever, hindering progress," the other man snarled, his tone contemptuous. "Enough," Levi said loudly, approaching, his presence seeming to make the strangers flinch. "He asked you to leave. You should listen. This is his land, and he has the right to decide." One of the men, throwing a card on the ground before leaving, shot Levi an angry glance. It read, "Land Development Associates." No name, just a phone number. Jacob looked shaken, his hands trembling. "They come every day," he whispered. "Always the same pressure. They want us to sell." Levi asked, "Do you know what they want from your land?" "Progress," Jacob replied bitterly, his voice full of despair. "But they never say what kind. Just progress." Then he fell silent, his gaze becoming thoughtful. Something similar happened about 10 years ago. People like that also appeared here then, pressuring farmers to sell their land. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Levi knew exactly what he meant. In his mind, like pieces of a mosaic, disturbing connections between the past and present began to form. Breener's return. On his way to check on Aaron's old farm, Levi noticed a patrol car parked on the side of the road. Sunglasses, tired eyes, a familiar face. Officer Breener. Levi's heart pounded like a trapped bird. He stopped his car and approached the patrol car window. "Levi Lapp," Breener said with a warm but somewhat unnatural smile, as if trying to hide something behind this mask of friendliness. "How are you? Long time no see." Levi didn't return the pleasantries. He was too focused on his goal. "I have something of yours," he said, his voice even, but with a hidden tension. He walked to his car and returned with the vest. Breener's expression flickered for a moment, as if a mask had fallen, before settling into a puzzled, familiar look. "Ah, yes, I completely forgot about that," he said, trying to regain his composure. "Miriam insisted on washing it for me. I think I spilled soup. That was the morning they left. I stopped by their place on my way to duty." "You never mentioned you were there that day," Levi said quietly, his gaze piercing, trying to catch the slightest sign of a lie. Breener nodded, his face inscrutable. "It didn't seem relevant at the time," he replied, his voice smooth, too smooth, as if polished. Then he added, trying to lend credibility to his words, "We were discussing security issues. Private developers wanted to build something nearby. Aaron was concerned. I just stopped by to check on things, offer my help." Levi thought of Jacob, of the two men in dark uniforms, of the progress that had threatened their community once before. Something clicked in his mind, as if the last piece of a puzzle had fallen into place, and Breener saw it. The sudden shift in Levi's gaze, the change in his expression. At that moment, a black truck appeared in the distance, the same one that had been at Jacob's property. Breener tensed, his eyes narrowing. "I have a meeting," he said quickly, his voice full of haste. "We'll talk soon, Levi. Right?" Without waiting for an answer, he sharply pulled onto the road and followed the black truck, like a shadow pursuing its prey. Levi watched until they disappeared around a bend in the road, leaving him alone with a growing sense of unease. Now, two questions burned in his mind like hot coals. Who were these so-called developers? And why was a trusted police officer shadowing them, instead of investigating the disappearance of the Lapp family? Part 3. Foundations and Shadows. The farm visit. After Breener's strange and hasty departure, which left Levi with even more questions than answers, Levi drove to Aaron's second property, a 40-acre farm located deep in the countryside, far from main roads and populated areas. This land, acquired by Aaron shortly before his disappearance, had stood untouched for years, like a forgotten corner of the world where time had stopped. The wooden gate, covered in moss and cobwebs, creaked as Levi entered, its sound echoing in the silence. The porch of the old farmhouse was weathered, the boards cracked from time and exposure, and a for sale sign leaned tiredly against a post, as if long having given up hope of a buyer. Inside the house, dust hung in the stale air, creating a sense of abandonment and desolation. But there was something else in the air, a faint feeling that someone had recently been there, disturbing the long-standing quiet. Levi, following an inner impulse, began to clean. He swept mouse droppings from the corners, wiped dusty surfaces, and opened windows to let in fresh air and sunlight. It was almost like preparing the house for guests, though he didn't know why he was doing it. Something told him to stay. Something invisible but palpable kept him there. At that moment, as he finished tidying one of the rooms, a gleaming black sedan pulled into the driveway, breaking the farm's peaceful silence. A well-dressed man emerged from the car, his suit impeccable, his demeanor confident and polished. He offered Levi a handshake, his grip firm and businesslike. "I noticed the for sale sign," the man said, his voice even and professional. "Is the property still available?" Levi nodded, his gaze wary. "Yes," he replied, studying the stranger carefully. The man walked through the house, but his behavior was strange. He surveyed the place as if it were a crime scene, not a potential purchase. He barely looked at the structure, its architecture, or its condition. His eyes constantly scanned the windows, the view, the tree lines, as if he were looking for something beyond the house, not inside it. Finally, he made an offer. It was half of Levi's asking price, an amount that was clearly undervalued. "That's below the land value," Levi replied, his voice firm. "But you're surrounded by Amish farms. Not ideal for development, is it?" The man smiled, his smile cold and calculating. They haggled, and eventually the man agreed to meet in the middle, but even that price was suspiciously low for such a plot. Then he unrolled a large map, spreading it on the dusty table. "Here's what we're planning," he said, his voice full of anticipation. Levi leaned in. The plot was outlined in red, filled with commercial symbols, shopping malls, residential complexes, roads. But one mark stood out. On the mountain to the north, circled and marked with unfamiliar symbols, like a mysterious cipher. "What's that?" Levi asked, pointing to it. The man quickly folded that part of the map, his movement too hasty, too nervous. "Not relevant to this property," he replied, his voice devoid of any inflection. He was lying. Levi could feel it. The man handed Levi a business card, which bore the company name, Land Development Associates, and urged him to follow him to his office, located just down the road. Levi hesitated, his intuition screaming danger, but he needed answers. He agreed, feeling that this might be his only chance to uncover the truth. The building was striking, glass and steel, a modern corporate structure, like a futuristic machine planted in the soil of Amish country, sharply contrasting with the surrounding landscape. Inside, everything was sharp, sterile, and impersonal, as if there was no room for human emotions. A woman in a dark uniform, similar to the men from Jacob's farm, asked for his ID and signatures, her movements mechanical. At that moment, Levi noticed the black truck he had seen earlier at Jacob's property, in which Breener had followed, pull into the parking lot. Officer Breener's patrol car followed discreetly behind it, but neither vehicle stopped. They turned and drove up the mountain road behind the office, as if heading to some secret base. "Ma'am," Levi asked, his voice full of sudden insight, "what's up that road?" The woman didn't look up, her face inscrutable. "You'll have to ask Mr. Davidson," she replied, her tone cold and detached. Davidson, the buyer, the model. While waiting, Levi approached a display case where a large 3D model of the future project stood. It looked like an entire small city, residential complexes, shopping centers, tourist attractions, all meticulously planned and detailed. He recognized his own home on the map, marked as part of the future development. Jacob Yoder's land, Aaron's property, everything was slated for demolition, for the construction of this new, alien world. But one building stood on the mountaintop, a white structure with the inscription Amish Heritage Memorial. A chill ran down Levi's spine. A memorial, not a museum, not a center. A memory. As if the Amish were no longer there, as if they were just a part of history, not a living, thriving community. It was an ominous premonition that made his heart clench with fear. The secretary called him back to sign the final forms, but Levi backed away, his mind racing. "I just remembered something urgent," he said, his voice strained. "Please tell Mr. Davidson I need to reschedule." She insisted, her voice urgent. "He's waiting. He's very busy. I'll be back later," Levi said, not giving her a chance to object. As Levi turned to leave, she picked up the phone, speaking urgently to someone, her voice full of alarm. He didn't wait. He ran, his legs carrying him up the mountain road, following the dusty trail of the black truck. The road was rough, clearly not intended for tourists or ordinary cars. Potholes rattled his tires. Every stone on the road felt like a jolt. Trees closed overhead like ancient walls, creating a sense of confinement. For almost an hour, he climbed, his lungs burning from exertion, his heart pounding in his chest. No signs, no movement. Only the wild nature seemed to watch him. Finally, the trees parted, and there it was, a construction site. Huge machines, scaffolding, workers like ants scurrying across the area. And in the center, a building resembling an Amish meeting house, but too large, too ornate, too elaborate. It was an authentic Amish design. It was a theme park version of their life, a caricature created for the amusement of outsiders. Levi noticed a hard hat and vest hanging on a fence, likely left by one of the workers. He put them on, trying to look like an ordinary construction worker, and walked through the opening, trying not to attract attention. The site was bustling with activity, the noise of machines and workers' voices drowning out his footsteps. At the far end, he saw them, Breener and the two men from Jacob's farm, the same ones who had pressured him. He approached closer, hiding behind piles of lumber, trying to remain unnoticed. He heard laughter, crude and cynical. One of the men pointed to a half-built foundation, his voice full of self-satisfaction. "This place will be perfect. Tourists love sympathetic stories. Simple Amish couldn't keep up with progress. Very touching." The other added, "We've waited 10 years. What's a little more? Everything's going according to plan." Then Breener spoke, his voice full of confidence, as if he were part of this sinister scheme. "I have trust, access. The department leaves Amish matters to me. They won't ask questions. No one will dig too deep." "Good," one of the men said, his voice full of satisfaction. "Soon this entire valley will be cleared. Nothing will remain of their old world." Then he added, and these words, like icy needles, pierced Levi to the core, "We buried them here." Levi froze, his breath caught. "Right here, under the foundation." They pointed to a section of fresh concrete where the foundation had just been poured. The excavator operator was ordered to dig. The excavator dug only a few feet before hitting something hard. One of the men reached down and pulled a human bone from the earth, white and weathered, like an ancient artifact. Part 4. What lies beneath? Bone in the dirt. Levi couldn't breathe. The air seemed to grow thick and heavy, pressing down on his lungs. From behind the stack of lumber where he was hiding, he watched as the man handed Officer Breener the bone, clearly human, weathered and long, as if it had lain in the earth for an eternity. The officer, without the slightest hesitation or sign of revulsion, examined it as if it were an ordinary object, and then tossed it back into the dirt like trash, as if it held no value, no significance. The excavator operator, his face pale, looked sick, his eyes filled with horror and disgust. He seemed to understand what he had just uncovered. "You see," one of the developers said, his voice full of cynical triumph, "we kept them here. The whole family, plus a few others who got too curious. They interfered with our plans, and we had to remove them." Levi's thoughts swirled like a whirlwind, horror, anger, and despair mixing in his mind. The developer's words, like a hammer, crashed down on his consciousness, shattering the last remnants of hope and ignorance. The whole family, echoed in his head, plus a few others who got too curious. This meant that Aaron, Miriam, and their 5 children, and possibly others who try to uncover the truth, had been murdered and buried here, under the foundation of this fake Amish heritage memorial, which was meant to be a symbol of their disappearance, their oblivion. Levi felt the ground give way beneath him. 10 years of searching, praying, and hoping collapsed in an instant, replaced by a chilling reality. His brother, his sister-in-law, his nieces and nephews, they were all here under this concrete, under this symbol of lies and greed. Officer Breener, the man they trusted, turned out to be an accomplice in this monstrous crime. He was not just a witness. He was part of a conspiracy that had hidden the truth for a decade. Levi had to act. He could not allow this truth to remain buried. He had to expose this crime, avenge his family, and all those who had fallen victim to this ruthless greed. But how? He was alone, against a powerful corporation and a corrupt police officer. He had to be careful but resolute. He had to find a way to bring this terrible truth to the world without becoming another victim, buried under the foundation of progress. In his eyes, a fire of determination ignited, mixed with deep pain and sorrow. The fight was just beginning. Aaron, Miriam, and their innocent children, they hadn't disappeared, hadn't fled in search of a new life, as had been presumed for 10 long years. They were dead, their bodies like unwanted refuse, buried beneath the foundation of that very fake Amish memorial, a cynical lie designed not only to sell tickets to curious tourists, but also to erase the very memory of their lives, their culture, their existence. This horrifying truth, like an icy blade, pierced Levi's heart as he realized the full depth of the betrayal. Threat to the living. One of the men, a developer whose face was contorted in a repulsive smirk, laughed, and this laughter, devoid of any human warmth, echoed across the construction site like a harbinger of new misfortune. "Once we drive out the rest, this valley will be ours," he said, his voice full of self-satisfaction and ruthlessness. "The remaining families will either sell their land, broken by our pressure, or they'll get scared and leave, unable to withstand the onslaught." Then he let the suggestion hang in the air, like an unspoken threat far more terrifying than any words. And if not? Breener, the officer who had once been a friend, slowly nodded, his eyes empty and cold. "I'll handle it," he said, his voice devoid of any doubt, as if he were a machine programmed to perform the dirtiest tasks. "I always do." A bone-chilling cold ran through Levi's entire body. It wasn't over. To his horror, it was starting again, and now the threat loomed not only over the memory of his family, but over the entire community, over every Amish home in that valley. The evil that had consumed his brother was now targeting everyone. A dangerous exit. Levi retreated, his heart pounding in his chest like a trapped bird, ready to burst free. Every sound, every rustle seemed deafening in that ominous silence as he crept towards the fence, trying to be as quiet as possible. His boots crunched softly on the gravel, and the sound seemed too loud, betraying his presence. Every breath, every exhale felt like a treacherous noise, capable of attracting the attention of those who had just revealed their monstrous secret. At the edge of the construction site, by the fence, he shed the hard hat and vest, leaving them where he found them, as if shedding the mask he had hidden behind. These items, symbols of his temporary disguise, now seemed repulsive to him. Then he ran, his legs carrying him down the hill, through thick bushes, to his car, which waited for him like a saving ark. Adrenaline propelled him forward, and the words of the developers and Breener echoed in his head like a grim verdict. The 911 call. His hands trembled so violently that he could barely pull his phone from his pocket. He glanced at the screen. There were only 2 signal bars, but that should be enough. Enough to connect with the outside world. Enough to scream about a monstrous crime. He dialed 911, and each ring seemed like an eternity. 911. "What's your emergency?" a calm dispatcher's voice asked. "My name is Levi Lapp," he said, trying to keep his voice from shaking, though everything inside him tightened with tension. I need to report a murder. Multiple murders. I just saw human remains, bones. And I have every reason to believe a police officer, Officer Paul Breener, is involved. The dispatcher paused for a moment, processing the shocking information. Sir, are you safe right now? She asked, her voice growing more serious. Yes, I've pulled over halfway down a mountain road. Near New Holland, in my car, Levi replied, his gaze fixed on the road leading back to the crime scene. We're sending units now. Please stay on the line. Don't hang up. I saw them digging up bones, Levi interrupted, unable to contain the surge of emotion. My brother's family. They disappeared 10 years ago. Aaron, Miriam, and their 5 children. They were murdered and buried there under that building. We're sending both local and state authorities, sir. Please stay on the line. It's very important for your safety. But Levi was no longer listening. He was already driving back up the mountain, his resolve unwavering. He had to be there when the truth came out. Justice arrives. Within 15 minutes, which felt like an eternity to Levi, the mountain was filled with the piercing sounds of sirens. 6 police cars, their flashing lights cutting through the morning air with bright flashes of blue and red, sped along the winding road, kicking up clouds of dust. Levi followed them, his old pickup truck seeming tiny against this swift procession, but his heart was full of determination. As they approached the construction site, the scene erupted with movement. Uniformed officers, like well-trained soldiers, stormed the area, their steps quick and decisive. Breener emerged from the building, his face tense, his eyes narrowed as he saw the patrol cars surrounding the site. He seemed to understand that the game was over. One of the developers, the same one who had laughed at the fate of the Amish, tried to leave, rushing to his black truck. But Levi, anticipating his maneuver, parked his car directly in their path, blocking the only escape route. "Where are you going?" he said, getting out his car, his voice calm but with a steel resolve. Breener approached, trying to remain composed, his face a mask of impassivity. "Levi, what is this? What's going on here?" "You helped bury them," Levi said, pointing to the fresh concrete, his voice full of accusation. "You helped kill them. You betrayed all of us." Breener's mask cracked, revealing fear and despair beneath. But it was too late. The lead sergeant, tall and authoritative, stepped forward. "Officer Breener, you're suspended pending investigation. Please surrender your weapon and step aside." "This is a misunderstanding," Breener mumbled, trying to justify himself. "Then you won't mind if we check," the sergeant said, his voice cold and unyielding. Unearthing the truth. The officers, following the sergeant's instructions, descended into the pit where the excavator had recently been working. Tension hung in the air, everyone present holding their breath. Within seconds, one of them shouted, his voice full of shock and disgust. "Sir, we have human remains, bones, torn fabric, children's clothing. This is a crime scene." In an instant, the construction site transformed into a grim crime scene, where a decade-old mystery began to unravel. Breener, realizing all was lost, tried to flee, darting towards the woods. A warning shot rang out, piercing the silence. "Stop!" the sergeant yelled. Breener froze, his shoulders slumped. The 2 developers, their faces pale with fear, raised their hands in surrender. One of them mumbled, his voice full of despair. "You're making a mistake. We can fix this. We can settle everything." "You already did," Levi said, his voice full of bitterness and pain. "You already fixed everything by burying my family." The office raid. Levi, despite the emotions overwhelming him, maintained clarity of thought. He told the officers about the office building at the foot of the mountain, about Davidson who had tried to buy his family's farm, about his suspicious behavior and the maps. "Davidson is there," he said, "the man who tried to buy my family's farm. He's part of this. He knows everything." Additional patrol cars were dispatched, and soon Davidson was handcuffed in his office. His secretary was questioned, and, frightened, she began to give testimony. Hard drives, maps, documents, everything was seized, becoming irrefutable evidence of their criminal activity. Everything was collapsing for the conspirators, Their carefully constructed empire of lies crumbled before their eyes. And Levi stood in the midst of it all, overwhelmed by the weight of the truth that had been revealed, but with a clear gaze in which the fire of justice burned. The mystery that had haunted him for 10 years had finally surfaced, bringing with it not only pain, but also long-awaited relief. Part 5. A Voice for the Dead. The police station. Levi stood outside the New Holland police station, watching as more patrol cars arrived, their flashing lights illuminating the twilight sky. Officers escorted Breener and the two developers inside, their faces grim and determined. The last arrested, Davidson, glared at Levi as he was led past, his impeccable business suit sharply contrasting with the gleaming handcuffs biting into his wrists. Inside the station, an atmosphere of urgency and chaos reigned. Reporters gathered, their cameras flashing, and phones rang incessantly, trying to get any information about the sensational case. But Levi had one task, one goal: to give a full and comprehensive statement so that the voices of his family, silenced 10 years ago, could finally be heard. He was led to a quiet room where a state police detective, a composed and professional woman named Detective Sarah Chun, awaited him. The testimony. "I know this has been overwhelming, Levi," Detective Chun said softly, her voice full of empathy, yet resolute. "But I need to hear everything from the beginning. Every detail is important." Levi took a deep breath, collecting his thoughts, and began his story. He told her about the photograph taken a week before the disappearance, about the clothesline in the background, and the sudden realization that something had never added up in the story. He recounted the reappearance of the police vest, his visit to Breener, the strange encounter with the developers at Jacob Yoder's farm, the office building, the black truck he had seen twice, and finally, the construction site on the mountain. He described in detail what he had heard, what he had seen, and what they had dug from the ground. Human bones, evidence of a monstrous crime. Detective Chun listened silently, her gaze attentive and perceptive. Occasionally, she nodded, making quick notes in her pad, her face remaining inscrutable, but deep empathy was visible in her eyes. When Levi finished, she looked up, her gaze serious. "We found something very important in Davidson's office," she said, her voice quiet, but every word carried weight. "A diary, detailed records of land acquisition, names of families, notes on intimidation strategies, how they plan to break resistance, and, most horrifyingly, references to your brother's family. It was a betrayal, Levi, cold-blooded and calculated. They didn't just want the land," Detective Chun continued, her voice hardening. "They wanted the entire valley. The Amish community interfered with their plans, their vision of progress. They were an obstacle that needed to be removed. They wanted to erase us," Levi said, his voice strained, full of bitterness. She nodded, confirming his words. Davidson's diary states that Breener used his position as a community liaison to gain trust. He identified which families had large plots of land, which were isolated, vulnerable, who would be easiest to break. "He ate at our tables," Levi whispered, his eyes filling with tears. He had seen Breener rocking a baby at church, laughing during harvest, smiling at children playing in the yard. It was all an act, a lie. "And Aaron?" Levi asked, his voice full of pain. "Why him specifically?" Detective Chun looked serious, her gaze full of sympathy. "Your brother owned more land than anyone else in the community, and he flatly refused to sell. He was a strong and principled man. They brought him to the mountain, tried to make a deal one last time, offering huge money. When he refused, they panicked. Breener was afraid he would go to the bishop or the press, so they decided to silence them. Forever. All of them," Levi said, his voice barely audible. "Even the children." Chun slowly nodded, her eyes full of sorrow. "I am sorry, Levi. I'm so sorry." Family found. Later that day, Levi's mother, Esther, arrived at the station. Her eyes were red from tears, but there was a fierce determination in them. She knew. Levi didn't need to say a word. Her mother's heart had already sensed the terrible truth. Nevertheless, When he met her in the hallway, she whispered, her voice full of both hope and despair. "Is it true? Do we find them?" He nodded, his voice full of pain, but also relief. "Yes, Mama. We found them. All of them." Esther's knees buckled, and Levi caught her, preventing her from falling. "They're just bones now, Mama," he said, trying to comfort her, though his own heart was breaking with grief. "But they're coming home. Finally." The forensics room. A forensic analyst named Dr. Martinez, a woman with gentle but confident hands, led them into a sterile room that smelled of disinfectants. She was professional and tactful, understanding the delicacy of the situation. "We have identified the bones of 7 individuals," she said, her voice calm and even. 2 adults, 5 children. The ages and sizes precisely match the Lapp family, according to your descriptions and medical records. Esther wept silently, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks as she looked at the evidence laid out on the table. Tiny shoes, torn fabric, a button Miriam had sewn herself, all those small yet significant items that once belonged to her loved ones. Levi held the photograph from the memorial gathering, the whole family smiling on the porch, alive and happy. He compared it to the pieces laid out in the bags, and his heart clenched. "It's them," he said, his voice barely audible. "All of them." Esther whispered a prayer in Pennsylvania Dutch, her eyes closed, her lips moving in silent supplication. "No more questions. Now we know." In the following days, the remains were definitively identified by DNA, confirming the terrible truth. The Lapp family had not run away. They had been murdered, buried like trash, beneath a building meant to glorify the culture they sought to destroy. Officer Breener was charged with multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and corruption. Davidson and the developers were charged with racketeering, involuntary manslaughter, and fraud. The town was shaken to its core, but the Amish remained calm, their faith and resilience unwavering. They mourned in silence and prepared for the burial, for the final farewell. Coming home. A week later, under an overcast sky, 7 simple wooden coffins were lowered into the ground in the Amish cemetery, nestled among green fields where the wind whispered its eternal stories. There were no television crews, no loud speeches, only quiet hymns sung by the community and a sense of closure that had finally arrived after 10 years of agonizing waiting. Levi stood beside Esther, their hands clasped, their faces filled with sorrow, yet also a certain peace. Their family was whole again, not in life, but in the peace found in their native soil. Part 6. What the community must face. The day after. In the days following the funeral, the town of New Holland was divided between disbelief and outrage. News of the arrest spread through Lancaster County like wildfire, shaking the foundations of the familiar way of life. People discussed it in the streets, in shops, in churches, trying to comprehend the monstrosity of what had happened. But within the Amish community, it was different. There were no shouts, no public protests, no demonstrations of anger, only a quiet, deep reflection. Because for them, this tragedy was not just about death and murder. It was about trust that had been mercilessly trampled. It was about doubt that now settled in their hearts. And it was about how close evil had crept to them, unnoticed, hiding under the guise of friendship and help. The bishop's meeting. In the meeting house, where an atmosphere of reverence and humility usually prevailed, a special gathering was called. The benches were full, people sitting closely, their faces serious and thoughtful. Men sat on one side, women on the other, heads bowed, waiting for their spiritual leader to speak. The bishop stood silently at the front, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the congregation, in each of whom he saw a reflection of shared pain and confusion. Then, to everyone's surprise, Levi stood up. He had been asked to speak, and despite his inner turmoil, he agreed. "I thought we were doing the right thing," he began, his voice even, but with deep pain. 10 years ago, when my brother's family disappeared, we chose faith over fear. We told ourselves not to ask questions, not to pursue the English for answers, relying on God's will. He looked around the room, his gaze full of sadness. We were wrong. We were blind. A murmur, like a gentle breeze, swept through the benches. Some nodded, their faces expressing agreement. Others frowned, unwilling to admit their mistake. We thought we were preserving peace, Levi continued, his voice growing firmer. But peace without truth is no peace at all. It is silence. It is a lie we tell ourselves. And sometimes silence kills. It allows evil to thrive, hiding in the shadows. No one interrupted him, not because they agreed with his every word, but because they were listening. And in the Amish world, listening was a sacred act, an act of respect and a search for truth. Community in conflict. After the meeting, groups formed in the gravel yard, where an atmosphere of friendly socializing usually reigned. People stood, discussing Levi's words, their voices hushed, but full of emotion. Some elders said Levi's words were too harsh, too direct for their traditions. Others whispered that they had long suspected something was wrong, that they had felt a certain unease but dared not voice it aloud. But no one, absolutely no one, defended Breener. The realization struck everyone at once like a lightning bolt. They had welcomed a wolf in sheep's clothing, a man who had used their trust, their reluctance to involve English authorities, their deep faith in separation from the outside world, to commit a monstrous crime. He had betrayed not only Aaron and his family. He had betrayed an entire way of life, the very foundation of their existence. Esther's letter. A few days later, Esther, Levi's mother, a woman whose wisdom and resilience were known throughout the community, wrote a letter. With Levi's help, who assisted her in formulating her thoughts and translating them into English, she sent it to the Lancaster newspaper. It was not long, just one page, but very powerful, every word filled with deep meaning and pain. "We do not seek revenge," she wrote. "That is not our way, and we do not believe in retribution. But we seek truth, and the truth was buried, like our children, under the weight of so-called progress and greed. We will no longer be silent. We cannot be silent." The letter was reprinted in several newspapers across the country, and suddenly the Amish found a voice, powerful and clear, without ever speaking into a microphone, without breaking their traditions. A new threat. One morning, Levi returned to Aaron's old farm for the last time. Although the sale had been canceled and the land remained in their possession, he wanted to walk the land, breathe its scent, remember the happy moments that once filled this place. But there, attached to the fence, was another business card. The same logo, Land Development Associates, but a new name written on the back, a different representative. They were still circling, like birds of prey, still pressuring, still waiting for their moment. They had lost Breener, lost Davidson, their key players. But the machine behind them had not stopped. It had merely paused, waiting for a new moment to strike. A choice to be made. Back home, Levi sat with Samuel, Rebecca, Jacob Yoder, and several other respected members of the community. He placed the card on the table, its glossy surface sharply contrasting with the rough wood. "We need to decide," he said, his voice serious. "Will we fight this through the courts, lawyers, the media, using their methods?" Silence fell, each person contemplating Levi's words. Then Jacob spoke, his wise eyes full of determination. "We are not people of courtrooms," he said. "We are not accustomed to such battles. But perhaps we can be people of defense. We defend our farms, our children, our future. That is our duty." Samuel nodded, his gaze focused. "And perhaps we don't have to choose English or Amish. Perhaps we choose both. Use their tools, but keep our spirit, our faith, our identity." Levi smiled faintly, a new hope stirring in his heart. "Then let us begin now," he said, and his voice held an unwavering resolve. Part 7. Quiet Resistance. A new strategy. Levi sat at his workbench, the familiar, comforting scent of wood shavings in the air, but his thoughts were far from the cabinet he was building. On the table before him lay 4 business cards, all from Land Development Associates, different names, different numbers, but the same game, the same threat. They weren't finished. Even after the arrests, even after Breener and Davidson were exposed, the company, or some shadowy group behind it, was still trying to buy out the valley, to break the will of the Amish community. But now the community was ready. They weren't going to fight with fists or respond with violence. They were going to fight with persistence, with their presence, and with unwavering unity. It was rare for the Amish to attend meetings with town officials, and even rarer for them to speak publicly, preferring to remain in the shadows, away from worldly concerns. But Levi and a group of respected elders, realizing the gravity of the situation, appeared at the next town hall meeting in New Holland. They were dressed in their best Sunday clothes, their faces serious, and they came prepared. "We are not asking you to change your customs, your lives," Levi said, standing before a crowd of council members, press representatives, and non-Amish residents, his voice calm but full of dignity. "We are asking you to protect ours, to protect our land, our culture, our right to live as we believe." They presented letters of support from the community, testimonies, land deeds dating back generations, proving their long-standing rights. They weren't just preserving farms. They were protecting an entire culture, a way of life that was threatened with extinction. One official, moved by their sincerity, said, "You are not alone. This town was built alongside you, not over you. We will stand with you." Applause followed, and it was the beginning of a new era, an era of cooperation and mutual understanding. Media attention. Rumors spread across the country. Esther's letter had attracted attention, and now reporters wanted interviews to tell this unique story. The Amish, of course, refused public appearances, but Levi spoke not for the camera, but through letters, editorials, and written statements that were published in newspapers and magazines. "We will not sell," he said, his words simple but powerful. Not because the price is not right, but because this land was never meant to be sold. It was borrowed from God for the time. We are faithful stewards. We are its keepers, not its owners. One news station ran a story about the quiet resistance in Amish country, and this story touched many hearts. Donations poured in, offers of legal aid and support from all corners of the country. A group of non-Amish neighbors formed an oversight coalition, vowing to protect the region from corporate overreach. Even Mennonite groups, close in spirit, offered assistance. For the first time, the Amish were not isolated. They were joined, and they felt the strength of unity. The trial and aftermath. In early spring, the trial began. Breener stood before the court, no longer an officer, but just a man in a suit, his face pale and drawn. The evidence was irrefutable. The bones found under the foundation, Davidson's diary, the testimonies of workers who had heard and seen too much. Levi was called to testify. He didn't want to, but he did, understanding it was his duty to the deceased. He looked Breener in the eye, his gaze full of pain but also unwavering resolve, and said, "You used our trust as a tool. You smiled in our homes. You held our children in your arms. And then you helped bury them. I don't need your apology. I don't want any other family to suffer as mine has." Breener did not look up, his face a mask of indifference, but inside, perhaps, something stirred. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. A new row now appeared in the New Holland Cemetery. 7 humble headstones, carved from simple stone. Aaron, Miriam, Eli, Michael, Sarah, Ruth, Daisy. Levi visited them weekly, his steps quiet, his heart full of memories. Sometimes he sat in silence, simply present. Other times, he whispered news of a new barn being built, of Esther's health, of how the community had finally opened its eyes and united. The buyers still knocked on doors, the pressure remained, but now the valley answered with one voice. No. The future was preserved, their land protected. Later that year, a land preservation trust was established, a legal shield for Amish lands, created to permanently protect them from outside development without community consent. Levi transferred the first land deed to this trust, symbolizing a new era. Jacob and Samuel did the same. One by one, farms were entered into the registry, not as sales, but as vows that this land would never again be stolen, not by bullets, not by bribes, not by silence. A year later, the wind carried the scent of corn and fresh hay across the valley, bringing with it the promise of a new harvest. A year had passed since the truth had been revealed. A year since Levi Lapp stood on the mountainside and learned in the most horrific way what had happened to his brother's family. And yet, in the quiet dawn light, peace reigned over the farm. Not the peace that comes from forgetting, but the peace that comes from knowing, from accepting, from fighting and winning. At the edge of the cemetery, set apart from the others, stood a small, simple monument, not for tourists, but for those who remembered. It was a symbol not only of tragedy, but of the unbreakable spirit that had endured in the face of evil. It read, "In memory of the Lapp family." They did not disappear. They were taken, and now they are home. This place was not intended for tourists seeking superficial experiences. There were no plaques or brochures explaining the story, only a humble stone beneath which the truth had been sown, allowed to grow in the hearts of those who remembered, who would not let oblivion swallow what had happened. Levi's mother, Esther, now in her 70s, but with hands still strong and skilled, returned to gardening. Her small plot behind the house, where her grandchildren once played, now bloomed with herbs, tomatoes, and vibrant flowers, as if nature itself was healing the wounds. Sometimes neighbors would stop by to visit, bringing quiet conversations and sympathy. Sometimes she would sit in silence, humming old Amish hymns, her voice soft but full of deep faith. "I talked to Miriam in the garden," she once told Levi, her eyes full of wisdom and serenity, "not with words, but with gratitude." "Gratitude?" he asked, a little surprised. "Yes," she replied, her gaze fixed on the distance, "for them being found, for their names being spoken, for the truth coming out." For the Amish, naming grief, acknowledging it, was an act of faith, a way to accept God's will and move forward. The Land Preservation Trust, established to protect their heritage, continued to grow, like a mighty tree taking root. New families joined, their numbers increasing each month. Even young couples who had not personally known Aaron and his family vowed to protect their land, understanding that it was not just property, but a part of their identity, their future. The valley was no longer just a collection of individual farms, scattered and vulnerable. It became a united front, an unyielding wall capable of resisting any threats. Land Development Associates, the shadowy organization that had tried to swallow their world, never returned. Davidson's company dissolved ignominiously, its reputation destroyed, and its criminal schemes exposed. Numerous lawsuits followed, and the money intended for development was confiscated, returning to the state treasury. Building permits were revoked, and all their grand plans collapsed like a house of cards. And the mountain, which was supposed to be the site of their triumph, became a restricted area, declared a protected site after the forensic examination. What was meant to be a theme park of Amish memory, a cynical caricature of their lives, transformed into a sacred place of truth, where every stone served as a reminder of injustice and the importance of fighting for one's beliefs. One afternoon, a news station contacted Levi again. They wanted him to appear publicly on television and tell the hero's story, turning him into a national symbol. He refused. His humility and loyalty to Amish principles would not allow it. Instead, he wrote a single paragraph for their website, simple but profound words that reflected his true feelings. "I didn't stop them. I didn't save my brother. I just listened, watched, and refused to forget." Truth isn't always loud. Sometimes it's patient, waiting under floorboards, in a folded vest, on a clothesline, in the most ordinary things. They printed it in full, and these words resonated with many people, showing that true strength is not always in loud declarations, but in quiet, unwavering resilience. One spring morning, as the air was filled with the scent of blooming trees, Levi went to the cemetery with his nephew, Michael Jr., named after one of the lost children. The boy was only 7, but he already understood that this place was sacred. He knelt beside the grave of his namesake, little Michael, and whispered, "My dad says you were kind." Levi looked at him, his heart clenching with tenderness and pain. "He would have liked you," he said softly, his voice full of unspoken emotions. They walked back in silence, their steps slow and measured, because sometimes silence ceased to be something to fear, something that hid secrets. It was something earned, something that brought peace and tranquility after long years of struggle. This story began with a simple note on a kitchen table, gone for the weekend. But it ended with a community that refused to be erased, refused to allow its people to be commodified, refused to let progress mean oblivion. They fought with unity, faith, and memory. And they won. Not just justice, but a future in which their culture and their way of life would be protected, and the memory of those who were lost would live forever.